Hafaday, and welcome to this series about ancient sites and traditions of Micronesia. These episodes introduce the latest research and discussions about ancient life, history, and cultural traditions all across our diverse region of Micronesia. I hope that you like this series, and I look forward to learning more together. In this next presentation, Mike Gawel shares about his years of learning about traditional ecosystems knowledge and practice in Micronesia.
A lot of the photos I'm using in my PowerPoint presentation was put together with the assistance of my daughter, Anne Marie, who's also assisting in the technology of getting into the Zoom presentation. I'm just expressing many of my observations in Micronesia, some of them more than 50 years ago. I'm not an archaeologist or an anthropologist or an historian, but I have worked with and learned from many such experts in Micronesia. But most of all, I've learned from Micronesians. They have knowledge of their environment that they've acquired over thousands of years. And much of this is being lost now, and I've just been able to touch on a bit of the knowledge on my own. In 1969, I came to Hawaii to train for the Peace Corps and was assigned to Fiji, where I served as a Peace Corps volunteer from 1970 to 1973 at the University of the South Pacific, which was a brand new university serving all the regional islands in the South Pacific. I had pre-med students that I taught that were from the United Nations Trust Territories in Micronesia. And I had Micronesian students in science from Kiribati and from Nauru. And I lived in the dormitories with these students as a volunteer. I ate meals with them. And so I learned traditional ecological knowledge and island customs and legends from them over those years. Then in 1974, I moved to Guam to study at the Marine Lab at the University of Guam, or actually 1973. In the summer of 74, I volunteered as a grad student to conserve and tag turtles for the Yap Fisheries Office. And so from June to August in 1974, I camped out at an uninhabited Hilo Atoll, which on the maps is called West 5. You can see it here outlined in red. It's about 40 miles from Atoll, kind of the end of the eastern end of the Yap Outer Islands of those days. I brought a little bit of supplies. We had a team working there. And actually looking at this aerial photo, you can see the island we lived at. It was a little green spot on the wide reef. You might note the large lagoon. And over the center of the lagoon on the north side of the reef, there's a little black spot that I might talk about later if we have time at the end of the talk. This is the island we stayed on. It had coconut trees, it had a lot of birds, and plenty of sea turtles that nest there every year. The resources at this island were managed by the island leaders from Atoll. The island didn't have adequate soil and groundwater to support breadfruit and taro farming, and therefore it was not permanently inhabited, but it had plenty of coconut trees and green sea turtles. I camped at the island with 9 Atollese and learned how to survive on an atoll. And this included climbing my coconut tree 3 times a day to collect tuba, as every team member did. Our team leader from Atoll was Mal Piailug, the traditional navigator. But unfortunately for us, he couldn't spend the summer with us at Piailug because he was sent to Hawaii that year to train Hawaiians to build traditional canoes and to navigate them. Following my graduation with the master's at the University of Guam in 1977, I started working for the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. I was there in a job from 1977 to 1980 as the first national environmental planner for the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. And in this job, we covered the 6 districts of those days of Palau, Yap, Truk, Ponape, which included Kusai or Koshai, the Marshall Islands, and the Northern Marianas. On that job with the Trust Territory, I spent most of my days traveling in the field and assessing and mapping environmental and cultural conditions so we could better plan for improved living conditions, but also conserve special natural habitats. We put together land use guides under the direction of the national planner, Lazarus Salier. These land use guides were books for each island that would be useful for development planning. At each island, this is an example of a picture of the cross-section of the different ecological zones I worked on an island in, say, in Truk Lagoon. For each of the islands in our booklets of the land use guides, we mapped the geology and the soils and the slopes, the ecological zones, and the cultural value areas, and what areas to conserve or to develop. And I worked with the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands archaeologist, Dr. Tom King. Some of you know, he developed the chapters in our books, Island Culture and Historic Values. Tom later drafted some of the U.S. National Historic Preservation Regulations, which are in effect now. And he was influenced in doing this by his years in Micronesia. Under the post-World War II administration by the U.S. of the formerly Japanese-held Micronesian islands, the permanent populations of the Marshallese on Eniwetok and Bikini Atolls were evacuated to allow the nuclear bomb testing. You might note there's ships that were in this test. The next slide actually has a location of one of those ships afterwards. Besides doing this bomb testing, the U.S. Army also established a ballistic missile testing range at Kwajalein Atoll. At the bottom of this slide, you see the main island of Kwajalein, which is restricted Army base for the U.S. Also along the atoll reefs to the north, there's a small island of Ebi, and farther north with the red dot is the island of Gujigu. Because of the Army base with a lot of jobs for Marshallese that couldn't live at the base, a lot of them migrated to Ebi Island, which is next to the base. And this resulted in a population density that you can see here. It was greater than the density of Manhattan and New York City at the time. We were in the Trust Territory Planning Office, we were assigned to design a new community settlement on Gujigu Island, which was being released by the Department of Defense of the U.S. to allow settlement for people on Ebi. And I estimated the water needs per household for the Marshallese families and designed rainwater catchment tanks to supply them with the water needs they would need each year based on the annual rainfall records. And we designed a village on Gujigu with concrete typhoon-proof houses. 20 years later, this community was really built. And also a causeway was put in connecting Ebi Island along the reef to Gujigu. Now also in the Marshalls there is Kili Island. The U.S. administration moved Bikini Islanders from their atoll home to this island, Kili Island. And unlike Bikini Atoll, Kili has no lagoon. It couldn't provide the traditional and abundant marine foods of a big lagoon. One of my jobs was I was assigned to assess the capacity of two other unradiated, uninhabited Marshall atolls to support the evacuated Marshallese populations. Of course, if these atolls could support Marshallese, they would have been inhabited at earlier times anyway. But anyway, I scientifically evaluated their reef conditions and their ability to support the needed renewable protein from the marine resources. I observed shared common values throughout my residency and work in Micronesia. This went from Christmas Island in the Line Islands south of Hawaii in Kiribati, all the way to the west in Palau. Frigate birds, when we were camped out on West Fayou, the Saudis called them down as they flew over from the sky, and they came and landed with us, and we fed them. They are kept as pets in Nauru and Kiribati and many islands, including the Mortlocks. And so I put this in as another resident of shared the islands with the Micronesians. The traditional Kiribati dances imitate, if you've ever seen them, they imitate the graceful movements of these birds in flight. And I learned this when I resided in Tarawa in Kiribati. After 2 years at the East-West Center at the University of Hawaii studying planning for islands, I returned to the University of the South Pacific in 1982 to teach marine courses, and then I became the resident manager of the University of the South Pacific's Atoll Research Unit in Tarawa. And there I continued learning of atoll subsistence. I had my own coconut tree again to climb and cut tuba, although they called it toddy in Kiribati. I learned of traditional sailing there among the Gilbertese or Kiribati. And this has been documented in the video you might want to see called Vikings of the Sunrise, showing how they built traditional canoes and sailed them. From 1982 to 1991, I served as the first Federated States of Micronesia Chief of Marine Resources based in Ponape. There I developed and managed fisheries and aquaculture and wrote plans. And in Chuuk, I married my wife, Isabel, 41 years ago. And she's from Nama, an outer island in the Chuuk state. And although most Micronesian islands had sufficient reef fish for their populations to support them, some of them, such as the lagoonless Nama Island, where Isabel's from, practice offshore pelagic fishing traditionally. This is as the early Chamorro fishermen were known to do. Nama Island has its own story, in fact, of an old man in his small canoe catching a large marlin. And if you've read Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea, it's kind of the same story set in Micronesia. Basic resources for sustainability in the islands. To be habitable, an island needs permanent dry land that can support fresh water for drinking and the basic foods of taro, breadfruit, and coconuts. And that's why without breadfruit and taro, West Five has no residents, although it has a valuable source of turtles, of course, and reef fish and other marine foods. Some similarities I noted regarding subsistence in marginally supported atolls and some islands, besides being able to grow breadfruit and taro, where one point is having sufficient sources of harvestable marine sources of protein, while recognizing that ciguatera poisoning from the normally eaten reef fish could occur, and we had to know how to avoid it. On many islands, I'm prejudiced, maybe from my tuba cutting, but the islanders would supplement their nourishment with the vitamin-rich tuba or toddy from the coconut flower sap. Although I would note that fermented tuba sometimes led to drunken problems and banning of tuba cutting from the islands in certain places, certain times. Another point was having a connection to communities on other islands to accept evacuees after disasters, for example, typhoons, like the Refaluash from the outer islands of Yap that could be accommodated in Yap proper at times of disaster. Or actually, some of them had moved to Saipan 200 years ago because of typhoons. And finally, I'm going to note the movements of Micronesians that I've observed from their islands during colonial and during independent times. The historic colonial resettlements of cultural groups did not always consider the long-term sustainability, as I had shown at Keeley. There are other cases that did work out on the transfer of islanders. For example, over a century ago, the Banabans were moved by the British from their small island in the Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony to Rambi Island in Fiji. And this would allow the mining of phosphate for exported fertilizer from Banaba Island, similar to the way phosphate was excavated at Nauru. Likewise, some Tuvaluans were moved from the crowded islands of Tuvalu to Kioa Island in Fiji. And they've retained their language and traditions, as have the Banabans at Rambi. The Phoenix Atolls, they haven't labeled on this map, but they're between Tarawa and the far eastern end of Line Islands of Kiribati. They're spread in that area, and prehistorically, they were never inhabited. Had migrants moved there during colonial times by the British government. I had a USP, University of South Pacific friend and student named Tabana Babai, who was born in the 1950s on Nikumaroro Island in the Phoenix Islands and the Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony. And traditionally, it was not inhabited until the British colonial government moved residents of other crowded Kiribati islands there in the late 1930s. But then after several years of severe drought with no rain that prevented subsistence on the islands, the residents were evacuated mainly in the 1950s to the British protectorate of the Solomon Islands, the High Islands in Melanesia. They were all moved before 1963. And they're there now, and they retain their Gilbertese culture and their language while they're living in Melanesia. Also in the country of Kiribati, the formerly uninhabited Line Island of Christmas Atoll now has a relatively stable population that were resettled voluntarily from the overcrowded atolls in Kiribati after Kiribati independence. Former president of Kiribati, Anote Tong, who used to cut toddy with me in our neighborhood on Tarawa, arranged to have Kiribati buy land in Fiji for voluntary resettlement due to climate change impacts. I expect the climate change impacts of the rising sea level causing loss of freshwater sources and of food crops, and the increasingly powerful tropical storms eroding islands and threatening residents will lead to increased voluntary immigration from many Micronesian islands. I believe that over 10% of Guam's population, for example, consists of migrants from the freely associated, recent migrants from the freely associated states of Micronesia and their children. I expect many more will have to move, and I fear that unlike the Kiribati on Rambi and in the Solomons and the Tuvaluans in Kiowa, these recent Micronesian migrants and their children will possibly lose their knowledge of traditional practices and languages. Their outmigration will increase due to the climate change hardships that are predicted. In closing, I'd like to show this brief video This was taken this year, about 6 weeks ago, on the outer Chuukese island of Lupino, or Lupinoch in the Mortlocks. And it's at a time where there was no typhoon, there was no tsunami or tidal waves. Far distant storms in the Pacific created a series of waves that washed right over the island. You can imagine the impacts of something like this. And it wasn't just Lupinoch, but other Federated States of Micronesia and Marshallese Islands suffered under the same storm. I'd like to thank you for your attention. This last slide I might note, when we were looking at the archaeology in Chuuk, this is High Islands in Chuuk Lagoon. The geology of Chuuk has sea level rising and islands sinking in geologic periods, not because of climate change. And therefore, some of the archaeological first settlements in Chuuk are submerged. But I think I'll close again, thanking everyone.
Thank you for joining us in learning about ancient sites and traditions of Micronesia. If you would like to learn more details, then I encourage you to visit, in person or online, the Micronesian Area Research Center of the University of Guam. Thank you again for watching this program. I hope that you will continue to explore and discover more.